Commodore updates its systems for the new decade. The Turbo Grafix 16 heralds in the age of the CD. And gaming takes to the web. These stories and many more on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
What is up, man? It's me, Mario.
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. I'm your host, Carl, and my co-host, Peter. Say hi, Peter.
Hi.
Excellent. So, well, we're back. It's a new decade. Well, theoretically it starts in 12 months, but for popular purposes, a new decade. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am running on the bare minimum amount of sleep necessary to not lose my mind.
Okay, and why is that?
Because I am now a daddy.
Really?
Yes. And not just in the, hey, baby, here's a $5 at the strip club kind of daddy. No.
So when you're asking who's your daddy, it's an honest question. Yeah?
It is an honest question, and I'm still not getting an answer, of course. So for those who haven't been following, yes, my wife's daughter, Wilhelmina, was born just under a month ago now. We're recording this on the 8th of January. Tomorrow will mark her 4th year ex utero, and yes, and so there's been a few sleepless nights and so on and so forth. So I'm really glad that I did most of the research for this episode back in December.
Yeah, and it's her 4th week, isn't it? Not her 4th year.
Oh, sorry. And that, my dear friends, is the reason why I have a co-host. Yeah. So, any lapses in my speed or other functionalities during the show today, I am completely and utterly blaming on the kid. Yeah, that's my go-to
and
now.
And this huge pile of unread comic books is as well to be blamed on the kid.
No, well, yes, kind of, yeah. My year's supply of Knights of the Dinner Table comic books that I have to get to now, probably the next few weeks. But
dude, you should take some paternity leave as long as she sleeps as much as she does.
I can't do that. My students need me. I'm vital to their future, and that's what I keep telling myself. And I'm not just basically there something to give credits.
Let's just hope your daughter won't listen to this in like 12 years. Like, why were you never there? That's why. All right.
Oh, my wife is already thinking that right now downstairs, so it's all good. Okay, but enough about those happy little tidbits. We're here to talk about the news of yesteryear. So, for anybody who doesn't know our format, we look at all the news from 40, 30, and 20 years ago relating to the video game and computer game industry. Now, we get these stories from magazines and newspapers and other sources, and we typically look at the magazine and newspaper cover dates, which obviously these guys are reporting on it post facto, so the events themselves may have happened a few months earlier or a month earlier, sometimes more than that, but we use the cover dates so that we have some kind of guidelines. Remember, if you have any comments for us, you can reach us on Twitter at VideoGameNewsR2. That's down in the description, you'll see it as well. Or send us an email to videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. I know it's long, but hey, you know you're getting the right one because there's nobody else who would be dumb enough to get an email address that long, correct?
That's right, man.
Exactly.
And don't forget our Patreon.
Exactly. If you like what we're doing.
I'm a financial guy, so.
Yes. Sign up for our Patreon. The link is down below. You can do it $1 a month, $2 a month,
$20 a month,
whatever you want. You know, it just helps us with the cost for hosting and everything else. Yeah. And also remember, you can subscribe to us on all your normal feeds. We also have the episodes posted on YouTube. So give us some thumbs up on there. That always helps, people find us and whatever else. Okay. that being said, let's turn on the time machine, which now, thanks to a wonderful supporter of the show and the creator of the amazing blog, The History of How We Play, link in the show notes below, we now finally have sound effects.
Wonderful. I'm excited.
Exactly, so am I. So, with no further ado, let's turn on the time machine and go back to January of 1980.
The interest in electronic games apparently
personal computers that can swallow a book. 1980.
Games people play.
And welcome to January of 1980. Take it away.
Take it away. HP goes PC.
Hewlett-Packard has thrown its hat into the personal computing arena. Their first microcomputer, the HP-80, has launched at the unbelievable price of just $3,250.
So a catch.
Oh, yes.
What a catch.
The 0.6 megahertz custom Capricorn chip-based machine sports 16K of RAM and an integrated 5-inch screen. Now, the machine is designed for scientific calculation work, and it would get a few more iterations before being replaced by IBM PC-compatible machines a few years later.
So they basically narrowed down the potential market to scientific calculation.
Pretty much.
Okay.
This machine, and there's a link to a New York Times article down below in the links as well as the Wikipedia entry. Hewlett-Packard, and we've seen this again and again over the last year or so, where big electronics companies that were doing the big industrial thing, keep coming into the personal computer market. We saw it with Texas Instruments.
Yeah.
We had last month the rumors about IBM coming in. Now we've got Hewlett-Packard getting into this. What it really is these big companies trying to figure out how do we get a piece of this personal computer pie, and they just don't seem to get it. Now Hewlett-Packard is coming in with a specialty device, which actually kind of makes sense. And these machines, as far as I can tell, and I really didn't get too deep into it, but there seems to be a following for these machines, just because they were very specific for a very specific purpose, and they apparently worked for that purpose at this time very, very well. So even though the system is not what you'd call super powerful or has a lot of RAM, it does have what you need for these very specific type of calculations.
So did it have any software, or did you have to program everything yourself?
I'm guessing that it came with certain programs included. I can't imagine they would have delivered a machine that was specifically designed for mathematical computations without giving you some kind of software for it. But then again, at this point in time, it was probably fairly bare bones. But that is pure speculation on my part. I know nothing about that side of it. It's just interesting to see another big company get in who, in the future, in the very near future, in the next 5 years, is going to become a major player in this market. So they're getting their feet wet, but they won't jump into the general computing, personal computer market until that IBM PC compatible standard arrives.
I mean, nowadays HP is a comparatively big name in this field. What did they do earlier?
Now you're asking questions. I honestly,
this is what I'm here for.
You are here for that. Well, HP was your general big computing company. They had done some desktop calculator type things, which could have been called computers. I mean, some people would argue that they were computers, personal computers, but they didn't really look like the computers we know today. And of course, famously, Steve Wozniak was working for them at the time that he created the Apple I and had offered it to them under rights of first refusal, and they turned it down because they didn't really see a use for it in the marketplace. So, yeah.
Man, I'm always amazed by the amount of knowledge you have.
And it's good thing that we wouldn't have to just stop the recording and go look this up on Wikipedia just to refresh my memory.
Right, we didn't do that.
Yes, exactly. We did not do that at all. Okay, so let's move on to our next story.
Yes, Commodore's pet learns some new tricks.
The Commodore PET got the 70s equivalent of an OS update. The new controller ROM chip being shipped in new PET models solves quite a few problems inherent in the original ROM, most notably the ability to natively support disk drives as opposed to just cassettes. The update does come at a cost, though, as some older programs may not work with the new ROM. I'm sure, though, that this is a problem that will quickly be solved on future computer upgrades, and they will never suffer the drawback of incompatibility between updates. Yeah, that didn't happen.
Yeah, right. So, but what you're saying is, when you ordered the update, you received a chip and you took out the old chip, threw it in the garbage can, and put in the new chip.
Basically.
This is a pretty cool update.
Well, think about it. It would kind of be like updating your BIOS.
Which I do over the internet nowadays.
You do it over the internet nowadays because it's a rewritable.
Yeah.
But they weren't always rewritable.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Okay. So these are the things, I mean, all the way into the 90s, when I, for example, upgraded my Amiga 500, originally had Kickstart 1.3, which was the basic operating system. And when I updated it to 3.1, I basically just turned in the entire computer because it was easier than opening it up and popping in a new chip.
Okay.
So because it wasn't a rewritable chip.
Okay, so here's my old computer, give me a new one.
I basically took it into the shop, and those guys then took my old machine and just upgraded the chip, but it was easier for me to do it this way.
So how was this ROM chip connected to the main board? Was it
on the Commodore PET? I can't tell you on the PET what the chip looked like, but I can imagine it's just an integrated circuit.
Yeah.
I mean, it basically just looks like a chip, little black thing with little metal legs, and you just pop it out and pop a new one in, and that's just the end of it.
Nothing. No need to. In the lack of a better word, melt the metal in between. You
don't have to desolder. The term you're looking for is, so when you make the metal solid, you solder something. So, and when you heat it up again so that it's molten so you can remove something, it's called desoldering.
Desoldering. Ha.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, I am growing vocabulary.
Yeah, as I said,
you didn't have to desolder anything on the later ones. Now, whether or not that was the case with the Commodore PET, I am the wrong person to ask on that. I am sure that there are people listening out there that are more specialized in this equipment than I am, who can and will definitely tell us.
Oh yeah.
But yes, but this ROM chip, the important thing here was that the Commodore PET originally shipped with a built-in tape deck. So a cassette tape player was built in next to the keyboard. And that meant that they only bothered to put in the command instructions for loading from tape to interface with the tape. Now, if you wanted to load from a disk, there were all sorts of different ways to go around making a disk work with a Commodore PET. But they required you to load extra drivers every time. This way you avoided that. It was built into the ROM, you booted it up, and that driver software was already installed.
And this driver software was compatible with every kind of disk drive?
That I can't tell you, because you have to remember everything was custom back then, unless it was coming from Commodore. Right. So at least it gave you a driver that worked with the Commodore drive.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but this is we're seeing how these machines are evolving. We're seeing how the original Trinity from 1977 is evolving into more complex machines, how the upgrades are coming, and how the technology is moving forward. The idea that they're doing this primarily for the disk drive means that cassette is already dying as a medium. Yeah. And this is 1980. Now, in Europe, cassette is going to be a valid medium for software up until the early 90s. But in the States, it's already dying at this point. Okay? So it's fun. Speaking of other computer software news.
And stuff that is fun, the Temple of Apshai gets not one, but 2 sequels.
As promised, Automated Simulations, later known as Epics, has started to release sequels for its Dungeon Quest system. The first new adventure, Morlock's Tower, will retail for $14.95. The test version sent to Compute magazine still required a whopping 20K of memory, but they were hoping to get the release version down to just 16K, so it would run on more of the installed systems. Creative Computing magazine, on the other hand, has gotten news of the Date Stones of Rin, MicroQuest 1.
What a name.
Yeah, which is the name they are using for their additional adventures using the Temple of Apshai engine. These smaller quests eliminated a lot of the character creation aspects and were also smaller in scope. The advertising for the series is also getting a bit brazen, with full-page ads for the original Temple of Apshai saying it's, quote, the best version of Dungeons & Dragons, end quote. You know you're in the Wild West days of an industry where that won't get you sued.
Were they sued?
Not that I know of. I could not find any reference to them getting sued for that.
I mean, the Dungeons & Dragons guys, they're
not licensing for games yet. The first licensed D&D game is going to come on the Intellivision.
Yeah.
And that's still a year or two away. So this is they're basically saying, hey, there's all these other games out there using Dungeons & Dragons or similar names in those soft side style sales catalogs.
But we are the best.
We're the best version of the Dungeons & Dragons experience. Remember, people aren't really calling it a role-playing game yet. It's just there's Dungeons & Dragons games and then there's everything else.
Yeah.
Just like the first few years after Doom came out, there were Doom clones. Nobody was calling them first-person shooters yet.
Yeah.
It was just you were a Doom clone. Right. Or you weren't a Doom clone. And so this is kind of cool. But I really like the strategy here because in the same month, they're sending one of their games to one magazine. They're sending a different game to another magazine.
Oh, that's
They're kind of spreading this out. Like, it's not one release or anything. They're kind of, I guess, testing the waters, trying to figure it out. I'd love to know exactly what their strategy was with this parallel shipping to different magazines to get different type of reviews, different types of products. There's a strategy here. I just can't quite figure it out.
Maybe they just want to see what kind of market share each of these magazines has, what kind of, how many customers will they reach using this or that magazine, and they see it in the selling numbers of either this or that add-on.
I didn't even think about that, but that's a brilliant strategy. Because, if you sold 10 copies of the first game, but only 5 copies of the other one, well, now
then
this is where we don't need to bother advertising there. Very cool. Very cool. See, this is why we keep them around, folks. This is the businessman here.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
Very good. Okay, so in other computer software news.
First of all, I want to say that I'm really proud of us, how we excite each other with our deep knowledge and understanding of the business, and I'm really not getting why we are not opening a business ourselves. Maybe because of risk purposes. Moving on.
Hey, I work for the government. I don't need that shit in my life, okay?
Yeah, fair enough.
I like it. I'm nice and calm. I got time to do my podcast. I got a little baby. Why would I risk anything at this point? Okay.
Alright, back to the more important stuff. Moose advertises their super text software in Micro magazine.
Even though they would become famous for their games, what might be their first print ad appears in this month's Micro magazine. And obviously Muse Software, for listeners of this show, they will know that we had an amazing interview with the founder of Muse Software just a few months ago. And, of course, you listened to it. I listened to it. Ed Zaron. So, Ed, I tried to contact him right before this, and I need to get back with him after the holidays. But this, I think, is their first advertisement. Yeah. And it's curious to see. He's going with the super text software, even though a few games have already been published by him. But he didn't bother investing the money for an ad on the games. He's going with the super text. He thinks that is the more important of the programs. And it's a simple ad, but we already have the Muse logo as it stands. and it's a sign of things to come. I mean, we've been seeing it over the last 4 or 5 months, how advertisement for software is getting more and more complicated, more and more sophisticated, more and more specific to one program. It's not, hey, here we have 30 programs for you to choose from on one page. It's, this software is important enough, we're going to put one ad out for it. And I think this professionalization of the market through advertising, through the evidence of people actually spending money on it. It's easy to say, oh, this was a professional product. Money where your mouth is. Did you buy an ad for this software? And if the publishers did, then it means they're expecting a return on their investment.
Oh, yeah.
And this is the beginning of that professionalization on a scale that we really haven't seen so far.
So the times when there was no money in software are finally over. Or at least coming to an end.
Or at least the expectation of money being in software has come to an end. Or has started. Sorry.
Yeah.
So people are really expecting a return on investment. Otherwise, they wouldn't be making these investments, one would hope. So.
Hey, let's bring some money.
So, leaving computers behind, what's going on in the arcade business?
Yes, Cinematronic sells Vector Beam to XD.
Oh, you got all those names right. I am impressed.
I'm impressed myself.
I probably would have screwed that one up. Very nice. So, Cinematronics, makers of Space War and later Dragon's Lair, are selling off Vector Beam, a company they had purchased a while before, to Exidy, another arcade game manufacturer. The sale would give Exidy a much larger manufacturing space and access to some of Vector Beam's patents, which were important for making vector-based games. The details of the sale have been recorded by Tim Skelly, a programmer at the company. The link to that very interesting bit of history is linked to the show notes. And when I originally read the original announcement of this sale in Replay magazine, I didn't really think much of it. I knew all three of these companies. I knew approximately what kind of games they had made. But then when I did a little bit more searching and found the Tim Skelly breakdown of the history of the companies, that's when it really started to click, because this was really a way for these patents on how to produce these vector-based graphics to be, or for certain players in the industry to not have to pay massive patent licensing fees anymore. So basically they're buying up the patents, the company that owns the patent, so they don't have to pay those royalties out anymore. And by not having to pay out the royalties, it's massively reducing the cost of entry for their games.
Yeah, although, of course, it's a big investment in the first place.
It's a big investment, but Vector Beam was already basically on the rocks. They had done a lot of research, but they didn't have a lot of hit games. And Vector Beam technology, while impressive looking, and it's impossible to really convey what Vector Beam graphics look like if you've never actually seen a vector-based screen. It doesn't work like a normal LCD or even a CRT. Vector Beam, there's no dots. It's just these bright, beautiful straight lines on the screen.
And I've never seen that before.
Oh, it's. Well,
I think I've never seen it before.
You've probably never seen it before, and it's unfortunately something that you younger folk are missing out on. Next time we go to the there's an event every year in Leipzig, Germany called Lange Nacht der Spiele. It's a one night a year event at a technical school where they have hundreds of machines set up and they have some presentations and so forth. And I used to actually run a D&D game there every year, but it's been a few years. And they usually have one or two Vectrexes set up, which was a little home system that used vector screen. It's not as impressive as an arcade cabinet vector screen like for Star Wars or Star Trek or Tempest, which is still probably my favorite vector game, just on a gameplay standpoint. But yeah, it was a beautiful screen, but it was a very limited technology. You were only going to get so many colors off of it. The graphics were going to be limited to a certain amount of detail. And so it was a dead end technologically, but it was very, very helpful in the early years of gaming when your pixel-based graphics, your bitmaps were just eating up too much RAM, but a vector with just mathematical points could be done very economically.
I mean, it's basically just a line between two dots and not all the dots in between.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this is why. Very, very cool technology, and that basically spreads out, and those patents are no longer as restricted as they were under Vector B. So, okay, and our last bit of news in this news light January of 1980.
Yeah, there's not so much going on in 1980, isn't there?
Well, the problem was most of the magazines and stuff were doing their decade retrospectives or their year retrospectives, and what you ended up with were very, very light news stories. We also don't have any proper numbers from the Christmas business yet. I did get some indications that the lack of chips that we had worried about last month and the month before did not materialize at the end, that the game industry had a very good Christmas, but the exact numbers won't be out for a while. So this is just kind of, we're stuck in this lull of new decade, everybody looking back instead of looking forward, and the news just got very thin. And I didn't want to throw in a bunch of fluff stories or things that really weren't important because, well, I've got a baby to take care of as well, and I don't have that much time. So, our final story for January of 1980.
Yes, Chuck E. Cheese breaks out of California.
Last month, we talked about the new funding that Pizza Time Theater, Nolan Bushnell's video game arcade / pizza parlor hybrid, obtained to expand, and this month, they have announced where the first non-California locations will be. Nevada, Oregon, and Arizona. All 3 territories will be franchise operations. Donald Marks, head of franchising, also said they were negotiating for franchises in Northern California, Idaho, and Utah.
So is there any reason why exactly they started in Nevada, Oregon, and Arizona?
None that I can tell, other than that they are all neighboring locations to California, which probably makes it easier to move stuff back and forth. And if you have any common suppliers for things such as ingredients for the pizza, maintenance staff for the electronics and so forth, the distances aren't that enormous.
Okay. Makes sense.
Yeah, so they're just spreading out from California. But the interesting thing here is that even though last month they talked about how they were going to be using the money to open up more company-owned stores, this big announcement is all about franchises, which means less investment from them, lower risk for them, and faster expansion, just because the more people come in, they can just start doing this without having to increase their own personnel and staff as much. So this is the birth of the massive expansion of Chuck E. Cheese, which is going to continue for at least another couple of years until the arcade crash. So it's all good. Well, that ends our trip back to January of 1980. Let's turn on the time machine with our wonderful new sound effects and jump forward to January of 1990.
Which was a wonderful year.
A very busy
this year.
Really?
And a busy year. And a busy year as well, yeah.
Really? That's what we're playing with? Who was born in 1990?
I don't know, man. I don't know. I just heard some really great people were born this year.
I was 14. Oh, Jesus Christ. On a purely biological level, I am old enough to be your father.
Yep.
Okay. Turning on the time machine now.
See your daddy now.
See you on the other side.
Today we have a ton of tips for some of the hottest titles around.
Mario Brothers 3.
You can't do that on an 8-bit system.
Welcome to January of 1990. So, Peter, let's start off with some console news.
Yep. Turbo Grafix CD hits the US.
While out in Japan since December of 1988, the North American version of the PC Engine's CD add-on, the Turbo Grafix CD, is finally out. It actually hit US shelves in November of '89, just 2 months after the regular Turbo Grafix 16. At $399 for just the add-on, this was not going to be an easy sell. Now, the Japanese release was a whole year after the PC Engine's original release.
Okay.
So, they're piling this on fairly quickly.
Yeah.
There's an argument to be made that they should have just released one unit.
Yeah.
But it would have been an extremely expensive single unit and probably never gotten off the ground. We would have been talking Neo Geo AES levels of stuff. Now, do you know what the Neo Geo AES was? Nope. Okay. Neo Geo was an arcade platform, an interchangeable cartridge-based arcade system that was released by SNK, a company famous for making arcade games. And they then released the same exact cartridge-based system from the arcades as a home console. Only that it cost almost 5 times what everything else cost. It was massively expensive, but if you were really, really well-to-do, you could afford to buy it. And we will be looking at the Neo Geo relatively soon. It's around the corner.
Okay.
But this would have put it in Neo Geo territory had it launched with the CD add-on.
Yeah, I only know the Neo Geo Pocket.
Neo Geo Pocket was their version of a handheld. Yeah. But yeah, the Neo Geo hardware is an amazing thing because it literally could not do background graphics. Everything was a sprite. But it could do a lot of sprites on screen.
Of course.
Well,
able to do a lot of sprites when you're not able to do background.
Exactly. And the cartridges were massive sized cartridges, tons of memory by cartridge standards.
Oh yeah, super cheap.
Yeah, so a single game could run you $200-300 easy. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And we're talking $1990, so you have to at least double, if not triple that for modern money. These were massively expensive things, but you ended up getting games like Metal Gear Solid on it, which was just fantastic. But okay, that's another issue for another time. But yes, so what we have now is the TurboGrafx CD comes out just a few months after the basic TurboGrafx. Everybody knew it was basically coming, and so we have our first CD-enabled console in the US market.
Well, that's surprising.
Yeah, well, we're going to see more about it next month when a major US company signs on to do games for it. Unfortunately, the wonderful CD is stuck saddled to an 8-bit processor. So we're going to see what can and cannot be done with that. But more about that in the future.
Just one more question.
Yes.
Do you recall how much they charge for the TurboGrafx?
TurboGrafx main system itself, at the time of its launch, $199. That was the launch price. Now,
really? That thing was cheaper than the add-on?
Well, you have to remember, we're talking 1989. Yeah. CD technology is extremely expensive still. You do not have widespread adoption of CDs yet. People are not listening to music on CD yet. I mean, it exists. The first album to be released on CD and vinyl at the same time was Dire Straits. I can't remember the name of the album, but it was the one that had the single Money for Nothing. Which,
and Chicks for Free.
And Chicks for Free. The amazing 3D graphics in the video alone make it historically important, let alone the awesome song. But that was not standard tech. It was extremely advanced stuff. And then to add on the fact that you're reading data off of this CD, and it could still play your CDs. Don't forget, it's similar to the way the PlayStation 2 could play DVD movies as well as play games. This is doing both of those. So it's an expensive piece of kit. And on top of that, they're not expecting to sell a lot of them. Okay. So you're kind of stuck with a very expensive add-on that's really just there for the super hardcore.
Who will never really get any software on CDs, because why produce a CD if just Joe around the corner has one of them?
Well, yes and no. Just remember that they're bringing it over from Japan. In Japan, the PC Engine was much more successful, and there was a lot more CD software for it in Japan. So they're coming over with a library of games already made.
In Japanese.
In Japanese. Well, remember, most of the games were shooters and stuff.
Okay,
Where you're going to
so
get
never
into
mind.
a trouble is adventure games and story-based games like Eyes or Wise. That's a big, huge RPG that does get translated. And like I said, next month we're going to find out about an American company that is going to be bringing story-based games to the system, or at least games that use more language skills. But that's a little bit of a preview for next month. So,
all this foreshadowing continuing in 2020.
Exactly.
Wonderful.
So,
Moving on
to another one.
Michael Katz is the new CEO of Sega.
Back in September, we talked about how Michael Katz left Atari, where he was the head of electronic entertainment, the home console division of the company. Now, he has been put in charge of Sega's U.S. operations. The Genesis just launched, and Katz would change the ad slogan currently running in this month's issue of GamePro, which was, quote, "Your world will never be the same," end quote, to the much more confrontational, quote, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." Now, he wouldn't last too long in this position, being replaced by Tom Kalinske in October of 1990. But this is a sea change. This is the first time that anybody is doing this. Well, it's a sea change in this generation. Yeah. We had seen this kind of comparison advertisement back in the Intellivision versus Atari days, very famously. But this really sets the Genesis apart from the Nintendo. It taps into the fact that the kids who grew up on Nintendo had been playing Nintendo for 2 or 3 years, who may have started off playing when they were 10 or 11, are now becoming teenagers, and they want the cool stuff. This is the beginning of the console wars, the traditional console wars that we always talk about in the 16-bit generation. And Katz sets the tone, but he can't right the ship fast enough. Remember, they just cut their ties with Tonka. They're just setting up their own real distribution network. Katz has a mountain to climb in front of him. He manages to get Sega to the top, but the heads in Japan just aren't seeing results fast enough for their taste, and so Kalinske will come in, and he's going to build off of what Katz started. Not to take anything away from Kalinske. Kalinske does some amazingly innovative stuff on his own. He brings product into the pipeline that's going to be extremely important for the future of the platform, but it's building largely off of the attitude change that Katz brings into the launch of the machine. Yeah. So Sega is becoming a contender in North America, where they were basically a very distant also-ran in the 8-bit generation.
Okay. You know, it always startles me that they never have any agreements in their contracts that you cannot go directly to the competitor, you know?
Well, they usually do. They usually have some kind of non-compete. Nolan Bushnell had this when he left Atari and stuff. And I don't know what the conditions were in Michael Katz's contract. Often those agreements don't mean anything if you are fired from the company. Yeah. Then you can go and work for somebody else. What the conditions were of Michael Katz leaving, I have no idea. And whether or not Atari really cared is another issue entirely. But yeah, that would be an interesting question to find out what was in his contract, but that is probably something we will never see. Never. So, oh well. But staying in the wild world of game consoles.
Oh yeah, it was a wild year. Unlicensed NES cards are all the rage.
More and more companies are trying to get onto the NES without having to deal with those pesky licensing rights. ShareData, a software publisher, will be porting the 1986 arcade game Chiller as they are billing as the first, quote, budget NES game at just $20 through their ACG label. Now, ACG, or American Game Cartridges, would only release 3 games for the NES before being shut down. The 4th game, Wally Bear and the No Gang, would be released by AVE in 1992. AVE, or American Video Entertainment, was a publisher of unlicensed games and maker of the Nina chip that made unlicensed games possible. So, if you're not familiar with Chiller, it was part of a line of arcade cabinets that used a gun, a light gun you shot at the screen, and it was famous for a scene where a bunch of people are in a torture chamber and you shot body parts off of them and stuff. Really unnecessarily gruesome garbage, and the game itself was kind of crap. But it was something that was going to at least be eye-catching and would have never passed muster in Nintendo's very strict guidelines for content. So if you wanted to get a game onto the NES back in the day, you had to be very strict on the content in North America. Now in Japan, they didn't have those same restrictions. They hadn't set up the same kind of licensing structure. So you had all sorts of hentai games and stuff appearing on the Famicom, the NES's release in Japan. But in North America, everything was clean cut. References to religion were taken out of games right and left. The Final Fantasy games had a lot of stuff taken out of them. And so having suddenly a game where you're blowing off body parts at least caught your attention in screenshots and advertisement.
Definitely.
And $20 is unbelievably cheap. You really never got a game on the NES for less than 30, 40, sometimes $60. That was common. And so suddenly $20 is an extremely budget title for a cartridge game on the NES at this time. And it's only possible because they're bypassing the licensing fees and so forth.
Yeah, sure. They save a lot. Sure.
Exactly.
So, first of all, ACG means American Game Cartridges.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. It was no, it was probably American Cartridge Games, or I got it wrong. It's AGC. Doesn't really matter. The company's garbage. But yeah. And
second, so what did Nintendo do? I mean, they weren't happy about those guys coming in saying F the chip and we'll develop anyways. And also, they surely didn't adhere to the 5 games a year limitation.
Well, they did, because they never released more than 5 games.
Okay.
But you are correct. Nintendo did look at them, and if I'm remembering the history correctly, and I'm sure some listener out there might be able to correct me on this, I don't believe Nintendo actually went after them due to the simple fact that they, unlike Tengen, who we need to talk about in just a moment, but we've talked about them in the past already.
Yeah.
Tengen stole the code. Tengen copied Nintendo's intellectual property in order to bypass the lockout chip. These guys actually developed the Nina chip. They've got a standalone chip that is doing the same thing as the lockout. They did a proper clean room on it as far as I've been able to ascertain. So there was no ground for Nintendo to sue. And I also think that at this point, they're not the 900-pound gorilla that Atari once was in the industry. These guys were nobodies. And the NES, at this point, doesn't really need to be defended as much as it just needs to somehow compete with the new consoles that are hitting the market. So I don't think Nintendo has that much of a fight at this point in them anymore. They've got the Game Boy coming out. They've got their own world going on. And I don't think that there was much of a fight here. They probably tried to do a cease and desist, but again, that's all speculation on my part.
Well, and the Super Nintendo was right around the corner.
Well, right around the corner is a relative term. It's going to be a little bit yet. It's going to be a little bit yet before we get the Super Nintendo. But yeah, the Super Nintendo is coming down the pipeline.
And also, I think it's interesting that American Video Entertainment was able to do what Tengen didn't. I mean, I can't make a catchphrase out of that, but...
Well, yeah. Well, they just put in the extra effort. See, this is the stupid thing with... Remember, at this point, we've talked about the Tengen battle, and we're going to talk about Tengen here again in a second.
What they call the patent office.
how they called the patent office and all this. But at this point in time, the Tengen-Nintendo battle is still raging in the courts. That hasn't been settled. Now, the battle between Atari and Nintendo for the rights to Tetris has been cleared.
Yeah.
That's done. But the battle over the unlicensed carts is not over yet. And this is also why Tengen, which is still the number one in unlicensed titles, has announced 8 new games, including a few ports of Sega arcade games such as Afterburner and Shinobi for the NES. Mm-hmm. And this would have been impossible with Nintendo's 5-game-a-year limitation. Right. So Tengen is still basically dumping games on the market. They got Rolling Thunder coming out and Gauntlet and all these games. Mm-hmm. And so that's all obviously going to come to a halt as soon as that lawsuit does get resolved. But at this point, the lawsuit is still running.
Right. So they basically have to hurry.
They have to try to hurry to do this. And I think at this point, they're still hoping that they're going to get away with it. But again, these Nina guys, they did it right. And by the time it all shakes out, the NES won't financially matter anymore.
Okay.
So, yeah. But that's it. Now, what else?
What else
is going on in the world of consoles?
Yes, the Konix multi-system is saved.
Well, maybe. So we've been following the Konix system for a while now, and after last month's delay announcement, meaning they would miss the Christmas season, we are now getting more details of what is going on behind the scenes. Epix, the company in the United States, we talked about them just now in our 1980 Jump automated simulations. They were distributing Konix's joysticks in North America. Now remember, Konix was primarily a joystick maker and a ZX Spectrum peripheral manufacturer. And they were limited normally to the European market, but now they also had a US distribution. And we've also talked just last month about how Epix has declared bankruptcy. Yeah. So that is having that's rippling out. So when Epix filed for bankruptcy, they ended up owing Konix a pretty penny. The exact amounts I could not find. Now, this must have exasperated their already tenuous financial situation. UK distributor Add-On has apparently come to their rescue with a hefty financial injection, giving them Konix the breathing room to finish development of their multi-system. The exact details aren't clear at this point in time. So the magazines are talking about this. They're saying, okay, well, they missed Christmas because they lost the money from the States, but, now they got a cash injection. Maybe this thing is still on.
I'm really looking forward to the release of that thing, man.
Yeah, you're going to still be waiting right now, okay?
Yeah, because, I'm really looking forward to the release of that thing.
But it's one of those stories that even though you know how it's going to end, just the dramatic twists and turns. I mean, I remember following this in the magazines at the time, just being like, what's going to happen next? Because we still didn't get to see any screenshots at this point. We have no idea what these games are, other than they showed us screenshots of Amiga versions of games that had already come out like a year or two earlier that were going to get ported, and we were just like, okay, but it's got a really cool steering wheel. We all wanted a steering wheel. And
what would be cool? If that would it would have been a gigantic scam, like a crowdfunding scam. Just give me your money, we promise. We'll deliver.
Well, nowadays, this probably would have turned into a crowdfunding project. I mean, that's the kind of thing that this would have been. But back then that didn't exist, and you needed to do it as a company. So, oh well. So the Konix story is not over yet. And
still rooting for them.
And let's see what else is going on in the UK.
Let's talk about guys that actually accomplish something. Nintendo launches big marketing push in the UK.
In an attempt to finally break into the UK market and hedge its bets in case its antitrust suit in the US goes south, 2 nationwide ads showcasing its entire line of products will air on UK TV.
Its entire line of products?
Well, you have to remember, they've got the NES, they've got the Game Boy, they've got the add-ons. Yeah. I mean, they're probably not showing every game, but they have a relatively large berth of product at this point.
Sit tight for the next 5 hours.
Yeah, but it really is Nintendo, and this has come out from other conversations and interviews that have emerged decades later. Not only were they trying to get part of the European market, but also they were really afraid of losing the antitrust suit launched by Atari against them. And when I say Atari, I'm talking Atari, the console manufacturer, not Atari Games / Tengen, the arcade / console game maker.
This is hella confusing, man.
Yeah, it is. It is. This is the Jack Tramiel company run antitrust suit, which they probably should have lost. Nintendo should have lost it. But Jack was cheap, got the cheapest lawyers, and kind of screwed the pooch. But if Nintendo had lost that, then the lockout chip would have been a non-issue. Yeah. They would have been banned from doing all of that. The console business as we know it going forward would have been completely different. Who knows if Sony would have even bothered to launch a system. Yeah. And so on and so forth. I mean, it has massive implications when you think about it in the long run. But this really was a moment where Nintendo is desperate to make sure that they don't lose too much revenue. So they had to open up new streams. And, I mean, they also pushed in Europe. I mean, in Germany, there was a small push around this time as well. They sold some units, but it never really caught on. People were just already stuck with Amigas, and they needed to do something better than those 16-bit home computers to convince people to dump real serious cash into a console.
Yeah. Well, wasn't there a Nintendo movie going on earlier?
Well, we talked about The Wizard. Yeah. That was last month. Exactly. And The Wizard was promoting basically the Nintendo catalog of games plus Super Mario Brothers 3, which was coming out.
So it was basically a huge 2-monthly marketing campaign.
It was a huge monthly marketing campaign, but the only problem was that even if you did show that movie in Europe, and I'm not even sure it got a wide release in European countries, it wouldn't have done you much good because that product just wasn't available in the stores. They didn't have the distribution arms. Okay. They didn't have the product in the stores. And remember, movies typically, there's exceptions obviously, like Star Wars. But movies typically, if you're going to sell product based off of a movie, you have to do it fast. The product has to be on the store shelves at the same time as the movie. Otherwise, you have no chance of capitalizing on that advertising. And yeah, it just wasn't going to happen. But oh well. And in
talking about things that aren't going to happen.
Exactly. Wonderful transition.
Yeah. Nintendo announces network services.
Nintendo announces that they are developing an online banking system application for the NES. This is, of course, similar to the online gaming system they talked about back in December of 1988, which also never materialized. Was this a real thing they were developing for the US, or just vaporware to take a bit of Sega's steam away in the wake of their Genesis modem announcement? And my money's on option B.
I'm just trying to picture how to handle an online banking system on the NES. Like,
same way that you do searches on Netflix on a modern television set with just a remote control with no keyboard. You basically use the directional keys to go through a list of numbers or letters to put in your account number, for example, to log in, and then you take it from there.
Right, but how would this stuff be processed? I mean, you have to connect it to your bank, so your bank has to somehow be connected to Nintendo, you know?
Well, this is all pre-internet, but what you would do is you would just have dial-up services. You would have a normal modem and you dial up to a local server or use a 1-800 toll-free number or a 1-900 number, and that would then give you the nationwide login. Similar to the way America Online did it at the time, CompuServe did it at the time, and had been doing it for over 10 years. Remember, we've been talking about CompuServe already back in 79. So this is not a new piece of technology by 1990. It's actually very mature technology. And you don't need more than an 8-bit processor to do this. Processor intensity is irrelevant, actually. Yeah. So you could have done this. It's just one of those things where I think Nintendo really was just trying to put out some counter advertising to Sega's announcement of a modem and online capabilities for the Genesis.
Okay.
Remember, the slogan is going to be, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Well,
which they proved by offering network services and not delivering.
Well, and Sega didn't deliver either, so it's all good. It all came out in the wash. But yeah, so probably just vaporware as far as I can tell. I couldn't find any other good sources for it, but it's fun to see that a year after it was talked about in news reports, it's showing up again. So, okay, but moving away from consoles and going to the granddaddy of video games, the arcade.
Yes. Really, the granddaddy, man. One foot in the grave. Arcade video games slumped in 1989.
Replay Magazine looks back at the year for arcade operators, a year that saw revenue slide sharply, in large part because of the rise of home consoles. The big hits were driving games like Hard Drivin', Stun Runner, and Off-Road. All titles that did things current consoles just couldn't offer. At the tail end of the year, a new juggernaut hit the arcade, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. For arcade prices, cheap board that offered amazing 4-player action with one of the hottest licenses of the decade. Now, TMNT is so successful that Konami has hired Dynamo to produce additional boards to meet demand as a second source.
This is incredible. A bunch of turtles.
Well, it's, again, and we're going to be talking about this a few more times because it keeps showing up, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle craze that is sweeping the United States at this point cannot be underestimated.
Oh, yeah.
It really cannot be understood just how big this is.
Think you have to be there in order to understand it. Hey, do you recall this one day when you and I think this one friend of ours who's now living in Great Britain was there with us, and we played this TMNT and played the first part of it, and you were super excited, and we kept falling asleep, and then you wanted to play the second part of it, and we're like, nope.
No. We played through TMNT 1, this arcade game. We did that through the Raspberry Pi on my TV, and you guys just did not understand the appeal of this game.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is always the problem with arcade games and why arcade ports to home systems are always a tough sell. Now, for anybody, and if you're listening to this podcast and you don't know what TMNT, the arcade game, was, I'm sorry, but these are two demographics that really should, two great tastes that go great together. TMNT was a 4-player arcade cabinet, which already on its own was almost unheard of, that you had 4 players on one machine.
So, and how would you stand around that thing?
Very simple. Each person had a joystick and 2 buttons.
And this was like built into the cabinet?
It was part of the cabinet, yeah. So you'd have the screen, and in front of it you would have your traditional arcade stick control panel, but it wrapped slightly around the screen, and so everybody was at a slight angle, so everybody would be looking directly at the screen as they were using their joystick.
Okay, and the fat kid had to stand either on the right or left side, but not in the middle.
Being the person who was the fat kid, I can tell you there was enough room for everybody. Right. I could stand wherever I wanted. No, but the thing with it was that, number one, it was 4 players simultaneously. Number 2, the graphics were very crisp and clean and looked very cartoony, which at the time was not necessarily something you would always get in arcade games.
Okay.
And number 2, it actually had like a plot. Every level felt like you were going through an episode of the show, with different story elements and the cutscenes and all the characters. And it wasn't just randomly inventing weird stuff like, for example, a few years later, the X-Men arcade game would do, where you spend an entire level fighting mutated trees and stuff. Things that didn't really necessarily seem to fit with the universe. Yeah. Or you'd fight sentinels that were only as large as a normal person. I mean, it just felt like somebody saw designs and threw them into the game without really thinking through a storyline for the game.
Well, we have a few sprites left. Let's use them.
Exactly. This really did feel like the licensors made sure that the things in the game matched what was going on in the TV show at the time. And that was important for that credibility for that group. And I played the game before even knowing what Ninja Turtles were.
No, really?
Yeah, I mean, the game showed up in Argentina, and we didn't have Ninja Turtles yet. And I had vaguely heard something about them from a friend of mine in the States the Christmas before. And so I'm playing this, and I've never seen it before, and we're all addicted to this game, even though nobody else knows what the Turtles are. But the game itself got us. But back to the issue with arcade games, we were playing it with an infinite number of credits. Imagine you're playing this, and each time you die, you had to now make the decision, do I put in another credit? So you actually had to think, am I going to run in and try to hit this guy? Do I try to jump around? And instead, the gameplay tactic was just hit the button. Oh, he killed me. Okay, I'll just keep hitting the button. And there was no fun there because there's no challenge. And when you're thinking, okay, I got 5 more quarters in my pocket, and
so you know, I should have put a jar in the middle.
I should have.
A die jar.
If I had just limited the number of credits or the number of resurrections people were allowed, that would have added a real sense of dread to the game.
Okay.
And that was missing when we played it. And unfortunately, this is something you can't replicate. The home ports of the game, I do believe, had a limited number of credits that you got to play through the game. That obviously changed the challenge completely on it.
Okay.
So, but yeah, this game, huge, both on a gameplay and a licensing standpoint. And like the replay article said, it was a relatively cheap board. We're not talking about really fast 3D graphics like in Hard Driving or Stun Runner, which were massively pushing everything. Off-Road, which was a 3-person game, but each person got a steering wheel and a gas pedal.
Oh, Lord.
So it was a much more expensive piece of equipment.
It's space consuming, man.
Yes and no. It was actually quite compact. It took about the same amount of space as a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cabinet.
Okay.
Because it also used the angles.
Okay.
But it was just, you're talking analog controls. You're talking foot pads and everything, and you can't just swap out the boards and put a completely different game in there because nothing else is going to work with this. They would release an add-on board for off-road later on that added more courses and so forth, but it doesn't change the fact that it's an off-road cabinet. It's always going to be an off-road cabinet, and end of story.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is the one bright light in an otherwise slumped arcade year. And again, kids are staying at home and playing on their NES. The arcades gotta go with bigger, more impressive stuff. And these are games that you can't replicate in the home, as we will see in a little bit. So, but staying in the arcades a little bit longer.
Yes. Popping more quarters. Dave & Buster's gets bought out.
Edison Brothers Stores, a conglomerate of specialty retailers, has purchased the fledgling 2-location entertainment center chain with plans to finance an expansion of the concept. By 1995, the chain would be spun off as its own company, just as Edison Brothers entered the first of its 2 bankruptcies, and ultimately becoming the, quote, adult Chuck E. Cheese, end quote, it is today. So Dave & Buster's is basically Chuck E. Cheese for people who grew up on real Chuck E. Cheese.
Okay.
So it's, you come in, you buy this card that has its credits on it. So you just walk around and play all these cool arcade games. You can drink beer, eat pizza, hang out with your friends, and have a good time.
I wish we had this here, man.
Oh, you are not alone. Oh, you are not alone. What I wouldn't give for a Dave & Buster's over here. Oh, no, yes, it's an amazing experience.
My girlfriend would look at me with an eyebrow risen, you know.
Yeah. She probably wouldn't enjoy it as much, but that's what I'm here for.
Thanks for bringing joy into my life, man.
At some point, we'll just have to do a vacation to Florida, and we'll go and hit the Dave & Buster's in Miami or Orlando, and do it that way.
Just want to have fun.
Well, there's also a GameWorks in Tampa. Yeah, we can do it. We can do it all. It's great. So the chain is going to go from a tiny little 2-shop operation through this bigger conglomerate to a much bigger entity. So it's cool. Now, let's go to home computers.
And stuff that is cool, or at least supposed to be cool. Amiga New Art Limited Edition A500S.
No, A500s. It's plural.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yes.
Those are released in Germany.
What do you do when your company is facing financial troubles and you are losing market share to PC compatibles? Well, you release a limited edition painted version of your computer, of course. 10,000 units of each of the 2 designs would be released. The housing of the machines have been given a very pre-Nirvana 90s makeover that is somewhere between muted Saved by the Bell intro and MC Hammer pant design. So, okay, you got the MC Hammer, but you didn't get the Saved by the Bell, did you? Okay, Saved by the Bell was a live-action television show targeting young teenagers about this group of high school kids. And yeah, I loved it as a kid, I have to admit. It doesn't quite hold up anymore, but very entertaining for the time. And it had this very graphical intro, spot-on late 80s type of thing. Okay, but yeah, so the A500 1990 is already getting a little long in the tooth. It's 1985 technology for all practical intents and purposes. And Commodore should be pushing out their AGA machines a year earlier already, and instead they're going to give us these painted cases because that's going to help.
This is what actually a whole lot of companies do.
Well, a lot of companies do them.
You know, and the collectors are happy about it for some reason.
Yeah, unfortunately, they needed to do something else. So, yeah, so Commodore basically, for me, this is just an example of how Commodore is clueless at this point.
I wonder how much you have to put on the table for one of those today.
That is an excellent question. You have to look on eBay. And if anybody wants to see what these things, these monstrosities actually look like, there's a link in the show notes. Just click on it. It's kind of scary. So, okay, but in Amiga-related news...
Yes, Cinemaware becomes an EA affiliate label.
Cinemaware has granted Electronic Arts exclusive distribution rights to their existing catalog of games such as Rocket Ranger, their Spotlight label games such as Speedball, and all future releases. Now, you might remember we've talked about the affiliated label thing in the past. Electronic Arts had a lot of companies. Ubisoft was an affiliated label in the United States and so forth. This is where EA does the distribution, even though they're not doing the manufacturing or development of the games and just getting a percentage for that. Now, Cinemaware has had to do this because their previous agreements with Mirrorsoft, Spectrum Holobyte, and so forth are basically falling apart because the Mirrorsoft group is falling apart.
Yeah.
And they're now hoping to get the games out through EA. And they've been spreading themselves further and further out. The Spotlight label is them bringing over European titles. And unfortunately, they're still betting on the Amiga. And that's kind of bite them in the butt.
Really? I mean, wasn't there just a limited edition released?
Well, only in Germany.
Oh.
And yes, in Europe they're still selling very well. This is affiliate label status in Europe, in the United States. In the United States. But yeah, it's not. There's not a lot of future in this. Let's put it this way. But CinemaWare, the fact that they have to go through EA now, is just showing that they're not a big enough company to stay on its own. Mm-hmm. And I really think that if this had happened 10 years later, Electronic Arts would have bought them up as a studio. EA would have said, hey, you guys are making a very unique product. We need that product to expand our line. Mm-hmm. But this is not that EA yet. EA at this point is not buying up studios like that. They've just started 3-4 years earlier building their own software. They're not at that point yet, unfortunately. Okay. And in other fun computer gaming news...
Yes, and this is actually a topic that's really important for me. Virgin licenses Dune.
Oh, I thought the Virgin thing was. Okay.
No.
Virgin Mastertronic has announced that they acquired the license to Frank Herbert's Dune. Interestingly, Commodore User Magazine, recently renamed CU, wonders just what they will do with the massive novel's story and philosophy.
Nothing.
Oh, that's not true. I mean, now, Virgin releases 2 games called Dune.
Yeah.
Now, and the story behind which game came out when and why there were 2 completely different games from 2 completely different studios on 2 completely different continents that became Dune 1 and Dune 2 is a story unto itself. There's a link in the show notes to a great article describing that history, because there's no way for me to do it justice here. But they did an adventure game that dealt with the politics and dealt with all of that. That was developed by the French studio. Mm-hmm. And then there was the parallel development, actually without the higher brass even knowing it was happening, by Westwood Studio of the game that would become Dune 2, the Battle for Arrakis, the real-time strategy game that would then spawn Command and Conquer and that entire strain of gaming. Mm-hmm. And so the first game is really trying to deal with not necessarily all the philosophical aspects, but at least a lot of the social-political aspects of Dune.
Exactly. And the second one?
And the second one was basically dealing with the resource management side of the novels. Because don't forget, the novels are about the management of a scarce resource and the battling and bloodshed over a scarce resource.
And how to build up a philosophy and religion so that the entire galaxy follows you blindly.
Well, that obviously, that only comes once you control the spice. Remember, what do they say in the novel and in the movie, you know? He who controls the spice controls the universe.
But the Bene Gesserit already without control.
Gesserit.
Sorry, Gesserit?
Yeah, Bene Gesserit.
Yeah, this is language. The concept of putting in the religion in planets, in the minds of people on planets, so that whenever one of theirs goes to this planet, people will see them as nearly a holy person. And this is just so...
The novel...
Awesome.
Dune is, if not my favorite novel, one of my favorite novels of all time.
Yeah.
I've read it 3 times in 2 different languages. I've read all of the Frank Herbert written sequels and the ones that were inspired by his notes. Haven't read any of the other stuff because I tried and that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Love it. Seen all the film adaptations, the 80s movie,
Sonic guns.
Yeah, of course. Come on, the weirding modules. The weirding modules. I mean, the David Lynch movie is a classic. Watched Jodorowsky's Dune, the documentary about the almost version that would have had Salvador Dali playing the Emperor. If you haven't seen Jodorowsky's Dune and you're at all interested in sci-fi, that is a documentary for the ages. And of course the sci-fi miniseries, which, they've got their budgetary issues, but from a script standpoint are very good adaptations of the first 3 novels. and I am looking forward to the new movie that they're making.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a new one. A new movie or a TV show? No, I think it's a movie. There's a new adaptation coming.
I hope it's good, man.
Oh.
I mean, in the times of Netflix and Amazon Prime Video and Disney Plus and whoever...
You would think a TV show would be the appropriate approach, yes. Yeah. And I can't remember if it's a TV show or a movie, but I think it's a movie. But yeah, so Dune, huge fan, played all the games. Well. And I do recommend, if you haven't played the original Dune 1, probably the best version to get a hold of. If you can't get a hold of the DOS CD release, the Sega CD variant is also not bad. It is worth playing. They got the menus down well with the controller, and I've played through that one. Now, I may have cheated a little bit because it is kind of unforgiving if you make the wrong moves and you got to go way back. But I did play through it. I found it very, very entertaining and an interesting adaptation of the source material. But yeah, so this is going to start up. I mean, this agreement here is not only an adaptation of a great novel, but also it's the beginning of the RTS. And the fact that CU Magazine is like, how are they really going to do this? And that you get two different studios taking the same source material, both with passion for the source material, and coming up with completely different approaches to what that story can be relevant in a game situation is extremely fascinating. I think it really is one of those moments where, had it not been for that subterfuge inside of the company, where they didn't know that they were doing two parallel developments, just seeing how they adapted the material is fascinating, because both games rightfully are Dune, in my opinion. But
I mean, I just played Dune 2 and I was pretty young by the time, so I didn't really understand the language. So I think a whole lot of the core concept just passed me.
Dune 2 is a strategy game, but when you think about it, that is what's going on in the movie, in the book. In the book, it's about who is going to control this spice, who is going to make the investment to build up. What did the Harkonnens do with the planet? What they sabotage stuff because, well, if you're not producing it, maybe we'll get the contract back, and so on and so forth. That back and forth, they took the license and said, okay, it's a back and forth. It's a battle over resources. It's spilling blood for resource. And if you start looking at it like that, and you start seeing those little troops, and you start to see a tank or a dune buggy or even a harvester go out and get destroyed, and you imagine there's people on there. Why did they die? Oh, so we can keep intergalactic commerce going.
Yeah, of course.
You suddenly have a whole different view of it. I mean, it's not as crass in its direct appeal to your humanity as cannon fodder, for example, but it gets the job done. I like to look at it that way, but oh well. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk about another great deal that's going on in the UK computer scene.
Yes, Codemasters gets into the CD game.
Back in our August episode last year, we talked about Rainbow Arts releasing... Well, I mean, this is our third year. This is the third year of the show.
Fair enough.
So very soon we're going to be running into, I might say November, and now the question is, was it November 2018? Was it November 2019? Or 2020? Once we get to the 10-year mark, there's going to be a lot of Novembers. So this is why I'm preparing these shows for future listening. This is a time capsule. People can come back years from now and listen to these shows.
You know, weirdly, right now I have to think about our show in 10 years, and we're recording this show, and your daughter by then 10 years comes in and is like, Daddy, what the hell are you doing there?
She'll be 8 years old, and she'll be like, oh my God, he's still talking about the 6502. And she will know what a 6502 is. God damn it.
Oh, yes. He tells her right now to get her to sleep, and finally it works.
Yeah, yes. I've turned my little miniature lectures about the evolution of different retro hardware. I'm up to the Game Boy right now, and it does do a wonderful job of putting her to sleep. So she was going to grow up knowing Gunpei Yokoi's name. Yes, and my students and everybody else I've ever met on a bus. Now, okay.
So who's the weird guy on the bus?
Okay, so back to our story. Back in our August episode, we talked about Rainbow Arts, the German publisher and developer, releasing the first CD-based game compilation for the Commodore 64, using an adapter cable so you could load games off of a CD using a conventional CD player, basically just turning the CD player into a tape deck. Now, British budget software masters Codemasters is one-upping them by releasing a CD that not only holds 6 games like the Rainbow Arts disc, but 30 games.
So did they make the games like 5 times smaller?
No, just remember, these old games, they were single-load games from tape, which meant that they had to fit in the memory of the computer. So if you're dealing with a Sinclair Spectrum that has 48K, that means the game can't be more than 48K in size. So if you're going to store those 48K on a 640 meg disc, how many games can you put on a 640 meg disc at 48K?
Well,
how many K in a meg?
1,000.
1,024.
Yeah,
640. Trust me, they could have put a lot more than 30 games.
Yeah.
But they're basically dumping a huge chunk of their back catalog from the last 7 or 8 years, just dumping it onto this disc.
Yeah, right.
And it doesn't cost them anything more than the production of the disc.
Exactly. I'm just interested in how they hooked up a conventional CD player to this.
Well, you have to remember, all these systems run on tape, normal audio tapes as storage devices.
So you basically put in you had a cassette, you had
a tape deck.
Headphone cable-ish.
A headphone cable type jack. Now, what the computer would have was normally an extra socket for this, but all it was really doing was acting like a modem where it was using audio sound as a way of transferring data. And that's all it was. That's basically it.
You know, back in the day when there weren't CD drives in a car and you only had cassette drives in your car, and then you would have those cassettes with a cable on it which you hooked up to a Discman.
Same exact concept. Or not same exact concept. Well, there is a little bit more detail to it, but basically that's the same concept. Yeah.
Good times, man.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not a terrible idea. The only problem is the more complicated games, the ones that require more than one load, don't work this way.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is why, for example, Rainbow Arts couldn't put Turrican, their biggest game, which we're going to talk about in a moment, on their CD because it was a multi-load game. There was no way to load the next section, which had to load off the disc.
The next track from the disc. I
mean, but remember, the CD player has to be controlled.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you'd have to reprogram it, and that would have required, an extra thing saying, "Oh, play track 7 now."
Yeah, exactly.
You'd have to go back into the program code and change that. And this stuff was done so fast and quick that they didn't bother. Okay. And even in an interview later on, the Codemaster founders admitted this was too little. It was a bad idea even at this time. And the main reason was that if you owned a CD player, you weren't playing on a ZX Spectrum anymore. If you spent the money for a CD player in 1990, you had already upgraded your computer because CD players were so expensive. Remember, we just talked about the Discman didn't exist yet. So, or if it did exist, it was an extremely expensive item. No, Discman did exist, I think, already at this point, but it was an extremely expensive item. And you weren't playing on an old 8-bit computer then anymore. You had already upgraded your computer as well. And so this is why it becomes a non-issue. And it fails. And next month, we're not going to talk about it, but I ran across it in my research for February. The American partner of Codemasters, a company called Comerica, they were going to they announced the release of the Codemasters CD for the Commodore 64 at the Winter CES, the Winter Consumer Electronics Show, and that also never really hit the market in the US. Okay. It was all this attempt to try to update and keep the old machines relevant with technology that, let's face it, was too expensive for this old equipment. The Turbo Grafix 16, while being an 8-bit processor, had 16-bit bus and graphics. That was sort of as high as you could go and still pull off a CD. Or, sorry, as low as you could go and still pull off a CD. This just, it wasn't going to work. But, oh well. In related news...
Yes, the German magazine 64er. I didn't butcher that.
No, you didn't. Imagine that.
Previews the new Manfred Trenz game Hurricane.
Yes, amazing looking game that would later be renamed Turrican gets its first public showing this month. The smooth 8-way scrolling and fast action showed just what the C64 could do. The game would end up getting ported to pretty much every system of the time and receive a variety of other ports and sequels.
Well, I was pretty busy at the time.
Yeah. You were in utero at this point.
No, I wasn't.
No?
Well, yeah, I was.
In January of 19...
I was.
So, no, but Turrican, this is like the gold standard of Commodore 64 action gaming. It becomes the gold standard of Amiga action gaming. It becomes the gold standard of German game development for years and years to come. And it's just kind of wanted to, mention it because it's cool. Okay. And our final story for January of 1990.
Hard driving for the C64 looms.
We normally try not to go into individual games here, but this story is worth showing a bit about how the European home computer market worked back in the 8 and 16-bit computer days. Ace Magazine has a quick little preview of two of the developers converting the 3D polygon-based car simulator hard driving to home microcomputers. Jürgen Friedrich is doing the Atari ST port, which would be ported almost one-to-one to the far more powerful Amiga and have a lower frame rate, and Mike Day, who did the Spectrum port that would get ported one-to-one to the Amstrad and lose out in the frame rate department as well. These games were pretty much ported by just one person with maybe an extra person to do sound and a loading screen. Mike Day was just 24 at the time. The games were less than stellar, but by no means because of a lack of effort or skill. Most of these games were written in under 6 months. In fact, the C64 version, the only to use a 6502 variant processor, would be written by Day in just a few weeks due to the original coder leaving the project. So yeah, one guy was doing the port to the Atari ST, one person. Yes.
Another person was doing the port to the Spectrum. Both sucked at frame rate, although the port destination was way more powerful than where the games came from.
No, well, okay. So hard driving was an arcade cabinet.
Yeah.
Using very high-tech hardware for its time.
Yeah.
It had a surprisingly high frame rate for its time with a surprisingly number of solid polygons. And it really felt like driving a car. It was an amazing thing to get into this cabinet. You actually had this wheel seat that sort of steered out and rolled you in. It really felt like driving a car.
Okay.
And bringing this very advanced piece of hardware to, in the case of the Commodore 64, at this point, an 8-year-old home computer, or the ZX Spectrum, which I believe was 7 years old at this point, and so on and so forth, was a monumental task. The more advanced 16-bit Atari ST and Amiga computers were much more powerful, but also not nearly as powerful as the arcade cabinet. Now, could good versions have been done for those machines? Possibly, but you were going to have to bring on more than just one coder and give them 6 months to do it.
Exactly.
And the worst part was, and this is really something that needs to be understood, both the Atari ST and the Amiga were running off the 68,000 processor that we talked about all the way back in, I believe, our November or December of 2008 episode.
Yeah, the thing is pretty old.
79 tech, used in home computers in 85, and now we're 5 years on from that.
Yeah.
And because they used the same CPU, you could relatively easily port the code over from one machine to the other. Now, the graphic chips were very, very different. The sound chips were very, very different.
Yeah.
The way they processed memory was different. But because they needed to do these ports so quickly and they didn't want to involve any more people, when you did these ports from one machine to the other, and the Atari ST was the weaker one, so you start with that one and then you port to the more powerful machine, but without any optimization, you basically get a slower machine, a slower game, because you're not using any of the extra features of the bigger machine.
Okay.
And this is basically what happened with these games. Same exact problem with the Spectrum and the Amstrad. They both had a Z80 processor at their core. So even though the Amstrad had a ton of additional features to do more things and more graphics, they weren't taken advantage of because that would have meant rewriting the code and optimizing, which they just didn't do. And the Commodore 64, which was the only 6502 system that was still being supported in Europe and the UK at that time, Z80 for the Spectrum and Amstrad, 68,000 for the Amiga and Atari ST, meant that there was less of a financial incentive to make that work. There was no additional port that was going to come out of it, and these were one-man projects. When one guy left the project, suddenly, well, the project was died. But remember, people had ordered it. The advertisements were in the magazines. You've got to have a product, and they did not end up releasing this product. This was one of the few exceptions where the game was so bad that they didn't end up releasing a standalone version of it, but they did end up releasing the game a little bit later as part of a compilation of multiple games. And that's how we got it. And anybody who has never experienced hard driving on the Commodore 64, there's a video in the show notes. You need to watch it because it is
awful.
It's awful. Instead of doing true 3D, even awful. Really, really slow, basic polygons, it's some form of wannabe sprite scaling that's supposed to look like polygons. It's almost like they took screenshots of the ZX Spectrum monochrome version, and then was just jumping them back and forth around on the screen to fake motion. It's a disaster on every level. And yeah, there's no better way to say it. And it is, though, encapsulated in one game the entire state of the home micro market and industry in Europe at this moment in time. And it's no surprise that when the Genesis hits in Europe, especially in the UK, it hits big because it's bringing a level of professionalism with the games. It's bringing a level of quality with the games, and it's also bringing an optimization to the code that we just weren't used to anymore. We weren't used to that quality, and it was going to really, really make the survival of the European market as it had existed almost impossible. And a few companies are going to survive this. The ones who are doing very unique or specialized things, the Manfred Trentzes of the world, who are optimizing their code, they're going to find a way. Factor 5 is going to find a way. But they're going to be the exceptions. Okay. That's it for January of 1990. Let's turn on the time machine and jump to January of 2000. I always wanted to say 2000 like that.
Oh, yeah.
Sounds cool.
Yep.
It kind of made me feel like I was doing one of those 1950s sci-fi movie things. It was pretty cool.
You're from the generation for who 2010 still sounds like sci-fi.
For whom?
For whom?
Yes. And yes, I am. Because, I still can't believe I'm living in the future.
Incredible.
It's kind of cool. It's kind of awesome.
All right.
I got a cell phone that tells me where I am on the planet at any given time.
And not only does it tell it only to you, man.
As the great writer Warren Ellis said, we all have a piece of magic glass in our pockets, and we have experienced the last generation in the developed world that knows the concept of being lost.
Exactly.
So
let's move to 2000 and let's see whether year 2K did kill us all.
Y2K?
Y2K. Oh, geez, it's getting late. I'm sorry, guys.
Okay, good. Let's jump.
As an industry, video gaming is bigger than Hollywood.
Y2K electronic launch in history.
Welcome to January of the year 2000. Okay, yeah, I really didn't need to repeat that. Okay, so.
Y2K didn't kill anyone.
No, it didn't. But it wasn't for lack of trying, number one. And number two, we do have to admit that a lot of effort was put in to avoid any problems from Y2K.
Didn't we have a good interview about this as well? Not exactly about Y2K, but about people
who worked on this. Quarter Past.
Yeah.
He was one of those coders who made sure that Y2K wasn't a problem and earned handsomely on the process. And this is why everybody says, oh, Y2K really was a false alarm. No, it was a proper alarm. Probably, it wasn't going to lead us all to nuclear Armageddon, but it would have caused a lot of problems had people not addressed it. And this should be the lesson we should learn is when there is a big problem, put in the effort, solve the problem.
And don't wait until
wink,
the last
wink,
minute.
climate change, wink, wink. Okay, now, back to more fun and excitement, because what's more fun than boobies?
Yep. The thing your little daughter is thinking right now.
Yeah. Yeah, but not in the same way that we're about to talk about them.
Not at all. Romero blocks Playboy.com.
Because any good news update deserves an Ion Storm Daikatana John Romero story. Computer Gaming World is reporting that after John Romero's then-girlfriend Stevie Kill Creek Case, famous hot gamer girl turned level designer, posed in Playboy, he had all IP addresses reposting the images and Playboy.com itself blocked on the company's internal machines. So, now, for those who do not remember Miss Case, she was the poster girl of Girls Game 2 for a while. Not only that, she was super hot. She was a really good Quake player, and she was John Romero's girlfriend for a little while. And when she posed in Playboy, it was a big deal in the gaming community. I remember she also posed for a couple of magazine covers and so forth. And, well, yeah, the fact that he had to block Playboy.com in the offices is just kind of funny in that regard.
So his employees needed to go outside to another computer, to an internet cafe, or just go home.
Let me just put it this way. It's one more delay for Daikatana at this point. And let's face it, it probably won't be the last delay for Daikatana. But yeah, so we're getting off to a fun start because there's a lot of stuff to cover here.
Why did you send your people home? Because I didn't want them to look at my naked girlfriend. That's why the project is delayed.
Yeah.
All right.
And talking about delayed PC games.
Yes, Ultima 9, plagued by bugs.
PC Zone is reporting that the final installment of the Ultima series, Ultima 9, has launched in the US with massive bugs, from showstoppers to extreme slowdowns on non-3DFX cards. The long-in-development game was, according to Origin Systems, developed from the ground up to run on 3DFX's Glide API, which would explain slow frame rates on TNT and GeForce cards relying on Direct3D. And we've been talking about this for months now. 3DFX is basically doesn't know how to cope with the rise of Direct 3D, doesn't know how to cope with cheaper TNT and GeForce cards, their failed attempt to become a manufacturer as opposed to a chip supplier blew up in their face, and the manufacturers, and this is something we're actually going to talk about quite a bit next month in the 1990 jump. Similar situation was going on with sound cards at that time, but this lack of one unifying standard is catching a lot of developers off guard, especially developers of games with very long development cycles like an RPG. Ultima 9 was in development for so long, it started out before there was 3D acceleration. Then they added the 3D acceleration during development, and they added an API that by the time the game came out, years later, was on its way out, and a bunch of users just didn't have the right card. So these long development cycles are having their problems. Standardized hardware is the solution, but until the industry comes to that standard, basically finds the one true path, this is the kind of stuff that happens, and it really hurt because Ultima 9 could have been this big, I mean, it had tons of other problems, mind you. And bugs were not just from the 3D graphics, but it could have been so much easier to develop had they had more standardized hardware from the get-go. So yeah, the wonderful world of PC gaming in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Oh yeah. Those times were a mess.
Yes, they were. Okay, and talking about another mess.
Yes, Babylon 5 license up for grabs.
In the wake of Sierra's ongoing collapse, one of the most anticipated games the company had been working on, an adaptation of the sci-fi TV show Babylon 5, has been put into mothballs, and apparently Sierra is looking to sell the license for cash. Sadly, no one would bite, and the license would revert back to the show's owners. The massive codebase created would just disappear into the ether, as would the footage filmed using much of the original cast from the show. So, yeah. Anybody who's watched Babylon 5, which was the first big TV show to use massive quantities of CGI as a cost-cutting measure more than anything else, but also to give the show a much larger scope, this could have been Sierra's Wing Commander. This could have been the game that made Sierra a contender in the 3D space action gaming sector, but alas, it was not to be. And because the problems can't end there...
Before we go to the next topic, actually, I want to mention something.
Yes.
In case any of the listeners are hearing a crying baby in the background, the issue is being taken care of.
Yes.
We are pausing like numerous times. We're recording this for like the last 4 hours.
It hasn't been 4 hours. Okay, it has been 4 hours. Okay.
4 hours.
But we did eat in between.
We did eat in between, right.
Yeah, so,
But we are constantly looking after the baby, and his wife is also with the baby. So everything is fine. We are not abandoning the baby.
There is no child neglect going on here. No. Okay. Thank you for adding that warning in case anybody is wondering why there's choppy audio. Okay. Okay. So, you were saying.
Yeah, so he is innocent. Microsoft, however, is found guilty.
Nice transition. You built that transition very nicely. So, on November 5th, 1999, federal judge Thomas Penfield Jackson ruled against Microsoft in United States versus Microsoft Corporation.
I remember that, man.
You remember this?
This is maybe the first topic that I actually remember.
There you go.
I was there.
The suit was an antitrust suit concerning the bundling of Internet Explorer with the Windows operating system. The judge's findings of law wouldn't get released until April, but he would ultimately decide that Microsoft must be broken up. That ruling would, of course, be overturned in 2001, setting new standards for how antitrust cases need to be judged in U.S. courts.
This is what introduced the when you install your Windows operating system, the this would implement the message that there are other browsers to choose from.
Basically, the thing that comes out of this, and by the time this happens, I mean, it really is a moot point because Netscape is pretty much already dead.
Oh yeah, sure. But Firefox is on the rise.
Firefox is on the rise, and of course there's going to be tons of other ones. And ultimately, it didn't matter which browser you used. Right. There was no money to be made off the browser as such because it became something that you had to get for free. But the real thing here was the question, can you break up Microsoft the same way that you broke up the Bell telephone company, AT&T, back in the 70s? And that's pretty much dead now. This is really the beginning of a shift towards more lenient approaches to corporations, and Microsoft is the vanguard of this on a case that, let's be honest, makes sense. And the comparison I used at the time, I remember arguing this with somebody, and I, at the time, was still not a huge fan of Microsoft, even though I had moved over to Windows in 1996. I was an Amiga diehard until then. Yes, I held on longer. It was not, well, it was a hard death, but a very long and drawn out one. But the idea was I compared it to cup holders in cars, that the operating system needs to come with certain pieces of software to make the computer usable on day one, and then an operating system is no use to you if you have to buy everything separate after that. We had those days with DOS. And so the idea that when you buy Windows, it also has a notepad program. It has a paint program.
And to be honest, in the
tools
early
for
days,
opening
it had the entire
images.
Microsoft Office on board.
Well, no. If you had a pirated copy, maybe, but you would maybe get Works installed with Windows, which was your Office Lite.
No. In Germany, most of the small IT businesses, they saw the entire Office suite. Yeah, I know the issue behind that.
But the idea was even if you didn't have that, you could still write a letter, you could still print it out, you could still draw a picture, you could still open up image files. The idea that you could also go on the web, that there would be a built-in modem function into the operating system, was just an expansion of it. I mean, the first cup holders for cars were made by third parties, so you had to buy them separately and add them to the car. When the car manufacturers added cup holders to the car, was it necessary for the car to function? No. Did it put the people selling the cup holder add-on out of business? Of course. Is anybody going to sue the car manufacturer for it? Of course not. Because that would be stupid. And this is just one of those cases where the web has become, and was already at this point becoming, such a basic function of the computer, was the main reason people would buy a computer. The home computer, other than for gaming and maybe some bookkeeping, had no function up until this point. But the web gives it a function. Let's face it, nobody was doing graphical art on their computer in order to print it out, unless it was a gift card maybe in Printmaster. Photoshop takes on its massive appeal when people start uploading images to the web.
Yeah.
Everything we know about computing today starts with web functionality. We've said it before with CompuServe's first services in the 70s. The future was access to other machines as a communication tool, as a massive database access tool, and to not have a web browser automatically on the computer and forcing people to buy a box copy of Netscape Navigator, which was a thing back in the day, just didn't make any sense. And unfortunately, though, the precedent that comes out of the courts for this is so much broader and impacted areas where antitrust really still should have been applied, is kind of disappointing. But oh well, that's another issue entirely. And since we're still on fun, uplifting stories...
Well, this was not so fun, actually. Maybe
I was trying to be sarcastic because it's going to get worse from here.
Neither fun nor uplifting. FAA bans in-flight entertainment systems.
Following the 1998 crash of Swiss Air 111 off of Nova Scotia, the Federal Aviation Agency has banned the use of in-flight entertainment systems such as the one that Swiss Air had installed from a Las Vegas company called Interactive Flight Entertainment. Now, the system was revolutionary for its time, with each seat on the plane getting its own screen, the ability to choose pay-per-view programming, and play games. Swiss Air had been hard up for cash and installed the system as an additional revenue source. Sadly, the high power needs of the system and some fast and dirty work installing the system led to the wiring being connected directly to the plane's main systems and its wiring coming into contact with flammable materials in the machine's hull.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, this was a really, really nasty piece of work. And we've talked about these in-flight movie systems before. We talked about the first ones being introduced. And at this point, they were pretty much in all the major airplanes. And, well, it's the fact that they did such a shoddy job installing it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also the FAA didn't quite understand what these systems were. They didn't take them seriously yet. Yeah. And they weren't properly controlling how they were installed, and that led to this tragedy. It's really nasty. Now, they put in this ban. Regulations did end up coming out, and this is why we still see these systems in machines today. I mean, this is why you can still watch a dozen different movies as you're flying over the Atlantic nowadays. Mm-hmm. But at this point in time, they shut them all down in order to basically rethink how to approach this problem. Yeah.
Well, it makes sense when the plane comes down just because someone wanted to watch a movie.
Yeah, or even worse, it came down because the company wanted to make an extra buck.
Right.
And there's nothing that's more easily a gateway to shoddy and dangerous work
than a company wanting to make an extra buck.
Than a company that is desperate to make an extra buck. So, oh well.
And speaking about companies that are desperate to make an extra buck.
Yes.
The transitions, they just rule.
This is not a fun month to report on. Yeah, go for it.
Sega's chairman sees a hardware-less future for the company.
Dreamcast may have just broken some sales records, but Isao Okawa, the chairman of the company and founder of CSK, the holding company that owns a controlling share of the game maker, sees the future in networking. He doesn't think hardware is the key thanks to e-commerce and digital distribution. He also thinks that the modemless PS2 will be at a disadvantage to the Dreamcast. Yeah, he may have been overestimating the power of a 64K modem on that one. So the news reports on what Okawa said, in many ways they feel prescient, but maybe 20 to 25 years ahead of their time. So
you don't need hardware when you have Google Stadia and whatnot.
And that's the thing. He's not really talking at this point about streaming, or at least it doesn't sound like he's talking about streaming. But he is talking about digital distribution. He's thinking that you need the online competitive play. You need to be able to buy games online without having to go to a store. That this is right around the corner.
It makes totally sense.
Exactly, except for the fact that the Dreamcast has no peripheral and no internal way of storing that game you just downloaded. The zip drive that we already talked about, which was announced, which never showed up, also wouldn't have really been a solution with only a few hundred megs of capacity maximum. And the idea of the 64K modem really offering that, even if you upgraded it to a high-speed connection, all is predicated on the Dreamcast getting enough sales to warrant an updated version that is supposed to replace at full cost the existing machines, or an add-on that people are going to buy. And Sega, with their history of add-ons, the 32X, the Sega CD, and so forth, they should have had enough internal numbers to know whether or not people buy add-ons in large enough quantities to justify this kind of move. But really, I think it's just a sign that they're looking past the Dreamcast hardware at this point. They're trying to prepare the investors for the eventual abandonment of this platform. That's just my hindsight decades later.
Yeah, it's just interesting that this thing is barely on the market and then they are already abandoning it, you know.
Remember, it had already been out in Japan for a year. They already knew that it was failing there. And the numbers in the States for the launch may have been okay, but they also know what software is in the pipeline. Way before the press knows, they already know which developers have dropped. Because remember, it's Sega producing the discs for the most part. So this means that they already know who's canceled before months and months before the magazines have.
And this is exactly what you need.
Exactly. And they're also doing the quality control testing. They know what software's coming in and whether or not this stuff is even any good. They're not stupid. They know.
But I think it's not a real smart move of the chairman to say, hey, we're abandoning this issue entirely.
Well, remember, the chairman has a duty to the stockholders. And if the chairman starts lying to the stockholders, it's going to bite him in the ass. Because that annual report is coming. Yeah, sure. And he cannot be saying something a month or two before the annual report comes out that is totally contradicted by the numbers in the annual report.
Fair enough.
So, yeah. No, it's just the writing's on the wall. The Dreamcast was never, ever going to succeed. It was a failure before the U.S. launch. It didn't matter what they did at launch. Bernie Stoller could have tried anything he wanted. It was already dead. But, yeah. Good little system, just wrong place, wrong time, wrong situation, wrong company history.
There are a whole lot of wrongs in here.
Exactly. So, but speaking of wrongs.
Interplay refocuses as a console developer.
After being acquired by Titus, as we reported recently, and trying to sell movie rights to its many game franchises, Interplay has decided to refocus as a console game developer after spending the last decade making computer games. The shift would give us titles such as Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 1 and 2, as well as Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, but not much more. So Interplay...
I don't know any of them. I mean, I've heard of Baldur's Gate, obviously, but Fallout Brotherhood of Steel?
Well, okay. Interplay was a traditional role-playing game. I mean, this is basically... They're coming out of the original deal with EA. They were the guys who did Bard's Tale. They do Wasteland, which is the forerunner to Fallout, if you will. They did Battle Chess. This was as computer gamey a company as you could get. Yeah. The move to console, shifting their entire development philosophy over to console gaming, was basically like having to relearn learn a new language.
Let's get into something we have no expertise in.
Exactly. So they're putting computer game labels, which mean nothing to most console gamers, onto games as if it's a selling point. Yeah. And it got a few sales. I mean, I even picked up a copy of Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. But I picked it up years later used. I also played Fallout Brotherhood of Steel. Mm-hmm. These were over the bird's eye view action games with very, very light RPG elements. Mm-hmm. And stories that sort of played in the same environment, but really the stories were virtually insignificant to the action. It was all about action. And they were fun games. I didn't mind them. But if you were coming from their computer side, you were going to be disappointed. And if this was supposed to get people to also buy some of the computer games, they were going to be disappointed. It was games. Very few game worlds are really easily adaptable from one genre to the other. Typically what happens if you try to take one game from one genre and make a spin-off in a completely different genre, it's going to fail. World of Warcraft is one of the few exceptions, but then we also have the Warcraft point-and-click game that got canceled because it didn't live up to expectations. We had the first-person shooter StarCraft game that never made it. We had the Command & Conquer first-person game Renegade that was kind of a miss. More than kind of, it was a miss. And so on and so forth. It's not going to work necessarily. And this was a desperate attempt by Interplay to get into a different area, and it just wasn't going to take off, unfortunately. But they now had a bunch of French money to play with from Titus.
Right.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about French money.
Yes, Infogrames by GT Interactive.
Back in December, we talked about how GT Interactive, the publisher that used to have an exclusive deal to supply PC games to Walmart and original publishers of Doom 2 and Duke Nukem 3D, was up for sale. Well, it's finally here. Infogrames, still riding the stock market boom in France, has bought the ailing U.S. publisher. Infogrames has purchased about 75% of the company's stock for $135 million. Infogrames beat out Hasbro Interactive, which stepped back from negotiations in November. Infogrames hopes to achieve $7 billion in revenue in North America in 2000. Yeah. According to their 2001 annual report, their fiscal year ended on June 30th. They only had annual revenues of $313 million in 2000 and $310 million in 2001.
Well, almost.
Yeah. Now,
so those $330 million, did they just achieve them in North America, or
these are the North American revenues? Yeah.
I mean, but still, they buy the stuff for $135 million, and then next year they get like twice as much.
Well, this is revenue. This is not profit.
No, I know, but still.
But remember, this isn't Infogrames' first entry into North America. I mean, they were already selling software.
This is not just
this is them just buying GT Interactive. Oh no, this is Infogrames total.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, the problem was GT Interactive, and we've talked about this several times on the show, but GT Interactive really, once they lose that exclusivity deal with Walmart, is floundering because they haven't invested in development studios. They haven't invested in new IP. When Quake comes around, they don't have a steady deal with any of the developers. Yeah. They've been doing it on a game-by-game basis. Which means that, great, they had a great hit with one game, doesn't mean that they're going to get the sequel. And so anything that they do want to publish, they're going to have to pay a big price for once it's already developed. They don't have the time to wait for a 3 or 4 year development cycle on a game to finish because, they're running out of cash.
Yeah.
And the fact that the French are coming in and paying this much money for basically the shell of a company that at
champagne for everyone,
that at best has like 4 or 5 year old catalog titles they fall back on, is just ludicrous. And this is why Hasbro jumped out. And it's funny, but they ended up buying. So Hasbro was also trying to buy GT Interactive because Hasbro wanted to get in on the gaming market, and Infogrames would later buy Hasbro Interactive a year later. But that one has all sorts of other ramifications that last until today, and we're going to talk about that when we get to that point next year. I don't want to spoil too much. Okay. Atari. So, moving away from computer gaming.
Pokemon movie had to catch them all.
So the first Pokemon movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back, opened earlier than planned in November over the Veterans Day holiday and raked in an impressive $50 million on its way to an $83 million haul in the U.S. Also opening that weekend, the movie I went to see, Dogma, with a paltry $8.6 million opening weekend.
I was on the winner's side, dude. I saw Mewtwo striking back.
So, Here's the deal. The Pokemon movie, we talked about it already last year when we talked about how Nintendo was bringing over all this established media material and ancillary product that had already sold well in Japan for their already years-old game Pocket Monsters. And so this movie hitting, I mean, we look at big box office movies today, 20 years later, and we think, okay, $100 million weekend or $180 million weekend for a movie. That's okay. That's the beginning of blockbuster, super blockbuster territory. $50 million 20 years ago for a animated kids movie that was really just product placement was insane.
This wasn't just product placement. It had an exciting story and 150 figures you can buy. 151, sorry.
Yeah. So, and this is the thing that this is this was earth-shaking.
Oh yeah, it was.
And it was hard for me to understand because I was already kind of old at this point. I was 23 years old when this movie came out. And yes, I'm not sad that I went and saw Dogma that weekend. Excellent film.
Oh, yeah.
But it really was just... It was a game changer. It really told us, hey, we haven't seen a big media phenomenon like this since Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 10 years earlier. Exactly 10 years earlier. Or almost exactly. And this would just run rampant for years and years and years to come and have legs just like TMNT. So, go figure. Okay, but the real story of the year is...
The web is where it's at.
Okay, and here we got a whole bunch. I'm going to try to get through them as quickly as possible. The .com boom is out there and knows no end. Playmeter magazine runs through some of the big gaming-related bits. Number one, we've got Midway, a classic arcade manufacturer, signs a deal to bring much of their classic back catalog to Shockwave.com. Now, Shockwave.com was a website that used the Flash, I think they had their own API. Yeah, they had their own plug-in for browsers that allowed you to play games and watch movies and all sorts of stuff. Well, and this included titles such as Defender, Joust, Spy Hunter, Moon Patrol, and Marble Madness. They will be Shockwave exclusive for 3 months before also being posted on Midway's own website. Now, I included a link to Shockwave.com. Doesn't have them anymore. But also a link to the archive.org website where you can at least see that there were links to these games back then. Shockwave is still around as a browser-based game platform, and Midway did post Flash-based versions of their games on their site at least by June of 2000. Now, I actually remember this. I remember going there and playing these games. Unfortunately, by this point, MAME already existed. So there wasn't a lot of reason for me to play these for very long, but still, it was kind of cool. Now, other news, too. Nolan Bushnell, founder of Atari and Chuck E. Cheese, has joined the board of directors of WebQuest International Incorporated that believes in the concept of free-to-play online games.
What?
Exactly. They will launch an online multiplayer version of Pong called iPong with its own Players Association and compete for cash prizes in tournaments.
So, what were the microtransactions in iPong?
At this point, everybody is not basing it on microtransactions because those are still too expensive to process.
Okay.
Everybody is using ad revenue. Ad revenue is supposed to make all of this work. The .com bubble is about to burst, and the idea of, you get 1 cent per, not click on an ad, but viewing of an ad was just not going to be sustainable. But WebQuest was really just an ISP, an internet service provider. And hosting service that seems to have been riding the wave and crashed, closing down operation in March of 2000. So just a month later, 2 months later.
All right.
So yeah, the iPong, as far as I can tell, never actually happened. Couldn't find any source on it.
3.
WebQuest was really just an This
is what you just said. 3.
iWorks Entertainment has joined forces with Stan Lee Media to create theme park attractions based on his new non-Marvel creation, Seventh Portal. Now, Seventh Portal was a series of animated shorts, and I may have also been comics, but I believe it's just animated shorts on the Stan Lee Media website.
Okay.
He was creating a bunch of basically superhero-based entertainment that was going to be played using Shock or Flash or whatever, and they thought, oh, so many people have viewed this, so many hundreds of thousands, it's so popular, it's more popular than the books. Well, yeah, people would click on it for 5 seconds, watch it, and then leave or whatever. It was the novelty of seeing animation on the web, and if you didn't have to pay any money for it, well, of course you're going to sit through it.
It's Stan Lee.
Exactly. It wasn't very good. It really wasn't very good.
Stan Lee, so you have to click it.
Yeah, exactly. And, well, the deal would later be made with Paramount for a 3D ride. And, yeah, it kind of died. There is a link in the show notes to some of this stuff. You can check it out. It wasn't very good. Yeah. Okay. And in other online news...
Yeah, 4. Thresh launches Gamers.com.
Dennis Fong, better known as Thresh, arguably the world's first professional gamer, has gone entrepreneurial with the launch of Gamers.com, a hub site for all things gaming. This first venture, which was started with $11 million in startup capital, would lead to a variety of tech ventures for Fong to this very day.
Interesting, but those were just the times where there was way too much cash on the market.
There were. But Thresh was an interesting character because he was one of the... I believe he wins the first QuakeCon tournament. And he's still out there today. He's still doing... all sorts of startups and whatnot. He was one of the few guys who actually kept a level head and did big things. Of course, Gamers.com didn't survive forever. There's a link in the Wikipedia. It ends up getting bought out. He sells it for a really good profit, and then it gets run into the ground. So, unfortunately, it didn't survive, but hey, it was the good idea, especially at that time. So...
Moving on. Origin hard at work on Privateer Online.
The rumor mill has it that beside the already in development Ultima Online 2, Origin is hard at work on Privateer Online. This project wouldn't last long, though, being cancelled before the year was out. EA was already developing a competing sci-fi MMO through Westwood at the time, Earth and Beyond, and Origin was already consuming resources with the development of Ultima Online 2. And this really is one of those weird things where EA first did not believe that Ultima Online could work until it was proven that people were willing to spend $5 just for a beta disc. Then they decided it could only work with Ultima Online. They didn't want to give the resources to Chris Roberts, probably because he really doesn't know how to budget things. We're still waiting for his new magnum opus to officially get released. And they probably were just worried about the budget going over, or this massively big open universe where you could trade and be a pirate or whatever just wasn't going to be a feasible thing. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, the Privateer series was an offshoot of his Wing Commander series. So while Wing Commander was flight, military flight in space, a Privateer had you as a civilian doing things like smuggling runs and transportation of people and scavenging and so forth. Had much more of a dark and dirty feel of what is everybody else doing in this world where things like the Kilrathi War happens. And it felt very much like a more story-driven version of the classic game Elite without the big open universe to really travel around it. There were 2 Privateer games before the series was canceled, and Privateer Online just sounded like an amazing concept, but alas, it didn't happen. and Beyond ended up becoming a short-lived or relatively short-lived game. Yeah.
Well, and eventually Microsoft and Rare picked up the idea and published Sea of Thieves.
I wouldn't use that. No. I'd say the closest we ever really got to the privateer concept ended up becoming the new Elite that got crowdfunded a few years ago. That's really the game that this should have been. But oh well. It would have been nice to have it in the Wing Commander universe. Alas, what could have been. And more persistent online worlds.
Yeah, but still existing until this day.
Yes.
I was astounded. World War II Online announced.
The most massive of online shooters, World War II Online, will be a persistent world game with thousands of players battling it out in real time. From foot soldiers to airmen to naval officers, every aspect of the war should be available to the players. Disturbingly enough, as you said, the game is still running to this day.
And being marked as early access in
Exactly.
Steam.
It's still marked as early access in Steam, even though it was available 20 years ago as a box game on the shelves. And I mean, they keep changing and tweaking the mechanics, so now I believe it's a free-to-play up until a certain level, or if you want access to the tanks, you do have to pay for a subscription or something like that.
So you stand around the tank and there's a paywall. You can't get in.
Basically. I just read through some of the comments on Steam. They keep changing the mechanics of the game, but it's still around. They haven't dramatically changed the graphics since then. I'm sure it runs at a faster frame rate than it used to, but it was a very interesting idea. I remember looking at it and wasn't interested enough to actually buy it and jump in, but it was an interesting concept, and the fact that it's still around means that it's somehow paying the bills for the server. So good for them.
Good for them, yeah.
Now, in other online news,
former head of CompuServe Germany acquitted on appeal.
Felix Somm was the head of CompuServe, one of the pioneers of online service providers from 1991 to 1997. He was the head, not that CompuServe was a pioneer from those years. The company had been raided by police in Munich for allowing users to access child pornography on the web back in 95. This raid had led to CompuServe blocking worldwide access to over 200 bulletin boards and starting a debate about online censorship. At the trial in 1998, some argued that there was no technical means for blocking the content, and if the court was going to hold CompuServe responsible, then they would also have to go after the head of the German phone company Telekom, which provided the internet backbone access. The trial judge found Somm guilty and gave him a 2-year suspended sentence and a 100,000 D-Mark fine. That's about $53,000.
I just would really like to see how the judge gave out the verdicts. Like, well, you're making an interesting point here. Guilty.
Well, and that's the thing. Now, this was all back in 98 was the trial. So 3 years after the raid. And now in 2000, the appeal was decided in November of 99. We're just getting the news now. And Somm has been cleared of all charges. And this was really a big moment. I remember this news story in 95 because the question is, and it's still a topic to this day with net neutrality, what is the responsibility of the provider in a system that is designed to be open for communication? And the argument that he made that the provider of the backbone, Telekom, should have been equally liable. I think that was one of the major factors here in the reason why we didn't have more of these trials and a lot more of these attempts. Now, obviously, AI routines weren't as good back then as they are today. You could probably have Google send an AI through the system and identify child pornography with a great deal of accuracy. And so on and so forth. So the question of the technical means may no longer apply. It may now be possible for them to do that. But the argument of liability is a good one if the technical means don't exist. And then the question is, if you're going to limit it only to the companies with the technical means to do it, until that AI becomes cheap enough for everybody to acquire, you're basically going to wipe out a lot of providers.
Well, the next thing is, what do you prohibit to be watched and whatnot? I mean, child pornography, of course.
Well, and that is the question of the censorship is...
But
political
views,
exactly. And at what point, where do you draw that line? Whose taste
18,
applies?
man. 18.
That's not what I meant. Okay. But this was an important decision, especially because, Germany is one of the biggest markets in the world. At this time, still very, very backward as far as internet access was concerned, but growing. Still a little, still very, very behind.
Still growing.
Yes. But it was an important legal decision in an area where most of the big legal decisions were happening in the U.S. We finally had a decision outside of the U.S. To give an idea of how this debate was progressing elsewhere. Okay, and to close off our time jumps today,
the day pinball died.
WMS Industries, the holding company of the venerable Midway, Williams, and Bally coin-op brands, has decided to leave the world of pinball and arcade video games. Their last attempt to revitalize pinball, their Pinball 2000 platform, failed to rekindle market interest in pinball, and so they will exclusively continue to produce their lines of slot-based gambling machines to this day. And so it's not a company going out of business, but in many ways it is a major division of a corporation shutting down. Now, Pinball 2000, for those who don't know, was a series of 2 machines. It was actually, a hardware platform that was supposed to support more in the future, but only 2 machines were made. A Star Wars Episode 1 machine and a sequel to Attack from Mars called Revenge from Mars. And what it did was you had your typical pinball table, and over the top, about quarter of the table, maybe a third of the table, you had a screen hanging over the table that would then be mirrored onto the table, so that you, as the player, what you saw was this computer-generated image on top of the table that matched up with the bumpers and everything else. So suddenly it looked like that top portion of the table had completely mutated into a different set of goals. And now you had animated creatures running around, and you had all these different sound effects, and it basically turned it into a mixture of both physical and digital pinball. So some of the effects that you would only expect from a computer version of pinball, like, for example, Alien Crush or Demon Crush on the Turbo Grafix 16, were suddenly possible in a real-world pinball machine. And it was a cool idea, but unfortunately, with the already declining arcade business and the extremely high expense of this machine, both to purchase and to operate, because it's a physical device, it's going to break a lot more often than, for example, a video game. It just wasn't going to happen. And so this left the last company in the business being Stern Pinball, which at the time was a very, very small operation. And this isn't the original Stern Pinball from the 70s. This was a revitalized Stern Pinball from the 90s. And they're still around to this day making pinball tables, and for a long time were the only pinball manufacturer on the planet. But the death of Midway, Williams, and Bally brands. Number one, the fact that they were all under one roof or one corporate umbrella was already a sign of the weakness of the market. But the fact that they're shutting down pinball really was a blow. And it felt like that type of game may be going the way of the dodo. but we still get pinball today, and all is good. Somewhat. Okay. So that ends our first time trip of the new decade.
Yeah.
Any closing comments or thoughts?
It's really hard to add something after you gave this speech about the day pinball died, dude.
I'm
really,
sorry, I get very emotional.
like,
Pinball is an important thing for me back in the day. I love pinball to this day.
You even built your little own pinball machine.
Yes, I built my own virtual pinball machine, designed it myself and everything, yes. So I love me the pinball. This hurt me back in the day when I read about it. And yeah. So, okay, everybody. On that sad note, remember, follow us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up on Apple Podcasts or whatever program you're using. Send us comments, send us emails. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear what you're thinking. We'd love to hear if we screwed anything up really, really bad. We'd love
money.
to, send us money. Again, a big, huge thanks for all the sound effects to the history of how we play, and the links down below. And yeah, also to all the cool people. I try to hang out a lot in the Gaming Alexandria Discord channel, and all the cool people over there. Big thanks also to our friends over at the Retro Asylum, our friends over at Retro Gaming Squad, and basically the entire community. Hey, send us a message on Twitter. Try to be really active on there as well. Gonna try to get onto Instagram a little bit more, but it's dividing up my time way too much lately. And if you guys have any other way or ideas of how to help us grow the show, let us know. And if you really want to, drop us $1 over on Patreon. That would be nice. Really, really nice. And other than that, see you guys. And there's a little preview. As soon as I get a chance to edit it, got a really great interview with Larry Wagner, the creator of Combat and chess on the Atari 2600. I just have to find the time to edit that with the baby here. It's been hard. And going to try to get maybe another interview or two in at some point, but probably have to put those off for at least another few months until the baby situation clears up.
Baby situation?
Well, I mean, just got to find the rhythm, man.
From GTA.
Hey, I still have a job on top of all of this. Okay. So, with that being said, have fun.